Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the podcast. My name is Billy Dees, and I'm here today on behalf of HO Press, Shore House Books, and all of the fine people at HumorOutcast.com. If you haven't had a chance yet, do check out that website, HumorOutcasts.com. New content posted pretty much every day there. They have a whole rotation of writers, and we always want to say hello to Donna, who manages the whole outfit out there. And we are talking today, on the phone with me today, I have Linda Day Smith. How are you, Linda?
I'm just fine, thank you.
Awesome. Linda is the author of a book, Standing Against the Rage. And this is based on the true story of Mildred Flatau and her miraculous escape from domestic violence. The book is based largely on newspaper accounts and historical records, along with Mildred's own diary. Our author and our guest today, Linda Day Smith, tells Mildred's story of survival from a horrific day of violence on March 17th, 1933, and how Mildred's faith was pivotal in her perseverance. Linda, that's quite the story. Let's talk a little bit about you first. Now, where are you from?
Well, going from a story that is just very compelling to the origins of my existence. I was raised in Boring, Oregon.
Oh, really?
No joke.
Well,
there's a town called Boring. It wasn't named because there wasn't any excitement around there, but there was a family with that last name, and they were one of the founders of the town. So that's where my grandparents, when they came out from Chicago, they settled in that area. And they lived there, my aunt and uncles, my parents, and somebody has lived on that property from the late 40s until just about 2 years ago when my niece sold the last family house there. So I now have moved, once I got married, about 7 miles away to a town called Sandy, which is in the shadow of Mount Hood in the Cascade Range.
Oh, okay.
Beautiful area.
Yeah.
So,
well, when you're not writing and researching, what do you like to do out in Oregon? What's something you like to do?
My favorite thing is my family.
Oh,
they are just. I have so much fun with my family. My husband is my absolute best friend. We've been married 41 years.
Oh, wow.
We just are very much in sync. We like to do the same things. One of the things we do like to do is travel. 2020 has not been friendly to those of us who like to travel. But we have a goal of visiting as many national parks as we can while we're still mobile, and we like to do some hiking. We were able to get over to Glacier National Park in September and did a 15-mile hike, and we still talk about how that was probably not wise.
Wow.
But it's an absolutely rugged, gorgeous, beautiful country.
Yeah.
We've never been disappointed in any of the parks that we've gone to, and so that's something we enjoy. We also enjoy spending time with our 3 granddaughters. They are beautiful and smart and funny.
Mm-hmm.
They keep us laughing, and that's something that we really are looking forward to in the next few days, being able to spend some time with them.
Yeah,
Christmas
sure.
season.
Yeah.
I also enjoy genealogy, and that kind of played a role in the book.
Oh, yeah?
I've done a lot of research on my own family and my husband's family, and the way I was able to track down Mildred's family was through using Ancestry.com, and I got a message back from Mildred's great-nephew saying, "How are we related? You know this story." And I said, "Well, we're not, but I'm trying to track you down." So that's was kind of a jumping off point. So really genealogy and my love for history was very helpful in writing the book.
Well, that was going to be my next question. So it's a great segue. I'm not sure exactly what brought you to the story of Mildred, but what stood out about her and this story that sort of grabbed you?
Well, when I began dating my husband, he was telling me about this story that happened on his parents' property long before they owned it. And I think, being kind of the guy that wants to scare the girlfriend a little bit, there's that noise we hear, is that the ghost of the Flatau family. And, when he actually was able to show me some newspaper clippings, I was just so drawn to Mildred and her strength and understanding that she was quite a young girl, 14, 15 years old, and somehow being able to have this, I'm not even sure how I can describe it. It's not intestinal fortitude, presence of mind. It goes beyond anything I was able to figure out. How she was able to say the right thing at the right time to survive. Yeah. When everything around her was crumbling. Yeah. It's so compelling that, like I said, I went to the extent of going on Ancestry and filling out a tree as if I was a relative to see if I couldn't shake some information out. And what I found just kind of kept confirming to me that I was supposed to write this story. Yeah. Well, what stood out to me as I went through the book was, I believe we kind of have this impression that one parent taking out, I don't want to give too much of the story, but being so violent, in a homicidal way toward their family, we kind of feel that this is a recent phenomenon, but this isn't. This has been going on a long time. This story happened in 1933. Well, if you go back to family issues, you can go back to Cain and Abel. Families don't always get along, and that's an unfortunate part of life. It's just that I don't think we talked about it that much. And I believe it was Farrah Fawcett back in the early 80s did a made-for-television movie called The Burning Bed that really exposed domestic violence and abuse in a way that was very raw. Yeah. And we began to be more open about those things, and people would take their family problems to a counselor and speak to a family minister or whoever that could actually help them in those situations. Correct. But prior to that, like in 1933, you just kept quiet. Yeah. You didn't want anybody to know. Yeah. Yeah, that was back in the day when it's unfortunately you can still get away with domestic violence, but back then it was really easy to get away with it. Of course, now this goes beyond, a family squabble. This was, like I said, I don't want to give away too much of the story, but this was a murderous rampage. So when you have a lot of pieces, when you have, let's say, news clippings, you have a diary, there's a lot of different components there. How do you sync up the timeline? I mean, it's obviously just making a lot of notes and laying things out, or how do you do that? I know people who write with an outline and they have everything constructed. I spend a lot of time just thinking and processing it in my brain. And as I looked at my available time and thought, this is the season to finally write this book. I'd known about the story for decades. I began seeing one of my favorite things out in the sky in the summer. We have some hawks that will fly around. And I thought, if I was the type of person that believed in reincarnation, I would think that's probably the Flatau family just flying over the property here. And I kind of toyed with the idea of using that as an intro because, like you said, this is a really horrific, violent story in some ways. And I just didn't know how to really spring that on the reader. Once I got the diary, it just was like a light switch went on. And this is how I tell the story, through her diary, through her own recollections. and different things that she experienced as she traveled from Sandy, Oregon to Detroit, Michigan.
Yeah.
Really was very cathartic, I think, for her. Whether she knew it or not, she began having things that would reflect back to that day. Yeah. And while it probably is not something that I would do again, as far as going back and forth in time, because it's hard to make sure that the reader knows where you are.
Yeah.
And that was something I talked with Donna and the editor, Kathy, at length. How do I make sure that people know where we are? Are we on the road trip, or are we back in Sandy? There had to be an obvious way to do that. But it just was so clear to me that that's how the story needed to be told.
Yeah.
Was using Mildred's own reflections on her trip. And as she, like I said, it was cathartic for her, I believe, in many ways, looking forward with each mile that was placed between Sandy and Detroit.
Sure.
I think her life changed, and I think she became more hopeful. The load was lighter.
Yeah. You had mentioned springing certain aspects of the story on the reader, and the reader being able to follow it. Overall, what impact do you hope the book has on the reader?
I hope that they can see in Mildred a resilience that is really available to all people that go through adversity. I liked a quote that Mildred's daughter, Danelle, shared. She says, "Mom never once used the tragic deaths of her mother and sister to say, 'Poor me,' and use it as an excuse.
Mm-hmm.
If Mom could live out her life after witnessing a tragedy like this, anyone can." And I think that's really the crux of her story, is that she was able to get past that.
Yeah.
I believe her faith played a huge role in that. But I also, if anybody has gone through that, I think that sometimes just saying, "Oh, pick yourself up, dust yourself off, you can get through this." Some people really do need and benefit greatly from counseling.
Oh, sure.
And I think that that's something that should never have a stigma attached to it. They are professionals, and they can really help people through that. But I think for Mildred, that place and time, people didn't really express their feelings to someone.
Sure, no.
So her faith was something that not only helped her get through it, but gave her something to do. She gave back to her community. She was a very giving person, worked in her church nursery, worked in the daily vacation Bible schools they had in the summers, was just very active in her community.
Yeah.
And I think that that's very helpful as well.
Sure. The book talks here again about domestic violence, and in your writings and in my conversations with you, you have mentioned that you've experienced this yourself. And I know you obviously want to talk about it and keep people's privacy intact, but you have mentioned it, and you do feel that it's important to mention. What parallels do you feel are present in a story like this, and in a story that someone like yourself may have in their own life?
It's my daughter who experienced domestic violence in her marriage, her first marriage. And it was a world that we were not familiar with in the least. And we weren't, red flags pop up.
Yeah.
You just, as a parent, feel very uneasy. She was living thousands of miles away from us. And she would share some things, and we would try to give her advice, and she wouldn't listen, or so we thought.
Yeah.
She wanted to be independent, and she had made her choice, and this person was just so wonderful and so caring about her. But all the things that we saw just sent up so many red flags for us.
Yeah.
And I wasn't sure, so I actually called and contacted the National Domestic Violence Hotline, and they were very, very helpful. They didn't ask any questions, that might reveal who I was or who my daughter was. They just sent me some literature, and as I went through the checklist, I just panicked because most of those things on the checklist were things that my daughter was experiencing.
Yeah.
And one of the parallels that I saw as I started looking at Mildred's life and what was occurring was cutting off from family and friends.
Yeah.
And that is something that my daughter, her boyfriend, eventual husband, kept telling, "Oh, you don't need them. They upset you every time they put me down. They don't want us together. You don't need them. I'll be your family. I can fill that role in your life." And with Mildred, it was her father sensed that the church was talking about the dysfunction of the family, so he cut them off from their church.
Yeah.
And, in a very small town back in the 1930s, church was your social life.
Sure.
It still is for many people today, but for them, especially living out in a very, very rural area, going to church once a week was probably the social event that they all looked forward to.
Oh, absolutely.
And also they would go to their neighbor's house, who was also a family member, and have Sunday dinners. Those were cut off. So it's really isolating the family members that are being abused from people who could intervene.
Yeah.
Control of money is another big issue for my daughter. It was, you don't need the cell phone in your name. You don't need the bank account in your name. I'll take care of it all. That's not your strong suit. I can do that for you. And for Mildred, it was kind of the lack of money, his refusal to provide income, made her mother more dependent upon staying with her father.
Yeah. Because
if you don't have income, if you don't have means, you have no power to leave. And we hear a lot about that in domestic violence situations where, if you don't have the money, you can't leave.
Yes.
And it's just a real something that holds people back. And so when we see shelters for women, those are worthy causes. We give to one here in our local area called Shepherd's Door, and it takes in women and children. So there are resources. So I hope anyone that might be hearing this and saying, yeah, I feel like I'm in that situation. I've got kids. I can't leave. I don't have any skills. I don't have a job. I'd have nothing. There are resources.
Yeah.
Don't let that hold you back.
Sure. And what we're talking about is the National Domestic Violence Hotline. And you talked about some of the warning signs that they provided. I'm sure that anyone who wants to research this can find out more. I don't know that I necessarily lived with a domestic violence situation. My father did have PTSD very bad. He came from a violent background. As a matter of fact, his father was responsible for his mother's death. He ended up in several orphanages where he was beaten there. And then he ended up in the service, excuse me, and his brother, which was the only real family that he had, ended up getting killed in combat. And I believe that was probably the final straw for him. He was very troubled. Now, he never hit my mother or I. He never had any of the controlling issues, but he did have an unpredictable temper. There were times when I would get in trouble in the neighborhood and all that, and everybody said, wow, your dad's going to be really mad, and he didn't say anything. But on the other hand, you could be sitting at the dinner table one day and drop a fork on the floor, and he would just go nuts. You never knew what was going to set him off. And, back in that time here, again, I don't go back to the 1930s, but even in the 1970s and 1980s, when I was coming of age, there wasn't a whole lot of resources back then to get help with that type of situation. And I feel bad, even though he caused a lot of grief for my mother, and I also feel bad that he was so tormented and really never got the help that he needed. But, like I said, he never hit my mother or I, but if he was out and about somewhere and somebody challenged him, they were going to get a fight. And that's one of and it's just a sad thing to have to live that way.
Right. And the one thing I do want to mention about, if you check out the National Domestic Violence Hotline online, it has a feature that cannot be tracked.
Oh, okay.
So if you go on to there, and then somebody comes back in and is looking at your history, I'm not sure how they have that set up, but they do have some little thing pop up and tell you that it's a safe site in those terms. So people shouldn't, I know that people who live with that type of situation are just always wondering, what is it that's going to set them off this time? I remember my daughter saying, that's the only person I gave any kind of, entire editorial control over, because it was her story.
Sure.
But she was telling me, she says, I knew that there were some places that we couldn't go because something might happen, but even things that were kind of approved, like, oh, these are friends that we can go visit.
Yeah.
Just, a glance or some misstatement that you just never knew. And she says, then you would go home and it was, chaos.
Yeah.
So, people can go to that site, or even, just go, you can, the book, I know you'll be asking about this later, but even if you just want to get the ebook form, it's you can see the warning signs on there. So whatever somebody needs to do to feel comfortable in seeing those warning signs, it's important to know if you're in that situation and need help.
Absolutely. And one of the stigmas, you had mentioned stigmas, is a lot of people who have never been in a situation, they say, why don't you just leave? Beyond the controlling factors, like controlling the finances and everything else, is there's psychological patterns that abusers rely on. And they create a world in the people that they're abusing. They create a world in their minds. And it's a psychological pattern of, I somehow deserve this. I did something wrong to deserve this. And when you're in that trap, when you're in that psychological trap, it's very hard to, get out of it. And it's not as easy as it sounds. And that's one of the things I would bring up about the stigma. It's like addiction or anything else. You get into a pattern and that's your life. And it can be hard to break that. And sometimes as parents or family members of people who are in these situations, you just have to be very understanding and supportive for people in these situations. And it's not just as easy as picking up and walking out the door.
Right. Yeah. And for us, being thousands of miles away, there wasn't a whole lot that we could do. It was very hard for me to understand because I come from a long line of very strong women, and I couldn't imagine, and I would try to teach my daughter the things that she was going to need to be strong.
Yeah,
but it just being strong wasn't enough in this circumstance.
Yes.
And you're in it, you're drawn in, and you're in it before you know it. And how can you extricate yourself? It is something that we don't fully understand if we're not in that. So no judgment for people who are in that situation and are just trying their best to figure out a way to exit.
Yes. And that's something that, empathy in these situations is very, very important. You have to put yourself in their world. It's not as easy as saying, why don't you just do this or why don't you just do that from your perspective, who is not in that situation. So empathy is very, very important. What we had talked about the impact on the reader. What do you feel is the best compliment you could receive about your book?
Well, there's two strands of thought there. The one is when Mildred's daughter responded to me and wrote a comment on Amazon, a review, and said that I told her mother's story well. I carried that burden for a long time through the writing process. I wanted to be true to the family's desires. I wanted to tell the story correctly.
Sure.
And I felt like I owed something to Mildred. And so that was, the biggest compliment that I could get in that vein of thought. On a more general vein, though, is if someone said, I learned I can overcome, if Mildred could overcome, then I could overcome. And it inspired me. If someone told me that, even if it was just one person, I would feel like, wow, okay, that's great. That made all the
yes.
the rewrites and the edits and all the research worth it.
Yes.
Because that's really, I think, what Mildred would want people to know. That through, I think she would be actually pulling more from her faith and saying, with faith in God, you can overcome. But by her example, yes, if she could do this, then what I'm dealing with isn't anywhere near that. Then I can overcome.
Well, it's sometimes even taboo, and I'm glad it's not getting that way anymore. But for a long time, talking about domestic violence or any type of, especially child abuse or anything like that, was very difficult to do publicly. But I'm glad that people can talk about it now, because it's so important for people to realize if you're in that trap of, I'm never going to get out of this, you got to keep in mind that there are people that recovery from these situations is possible. And the trap that you're in, that I'll never get out of this, is exactly what your abuser has intended you to feel. And people do overcome it, and there are resources that are available. Before we talk about where we can get the book, what you had mentioned the National Domestic Violence Hotline. Are there other resources for domestic violence that you would like to mention?
Yeah, that is the one that I have worked with.
Okay.
When my daughter needed some help, and she didn't know it, and I just needed information, that's where I went. And then when I was writing the book, I contacted them again and said, can I use these bulleted points of you may be in an abusive relationship if, and so that other people could go through the checklist.
Sure.
So that's the organization. There may be in other states, in someone's city, that are specific for them.
Sure.
I'm not aware of those.
Yes. I'm sure that there's people at this hotline that can point you in the right direction if necessary. There are ways in local communities. You just have to do a little digging. As you mentioned, with the National Domestic Violence Hotline, they can keep that confidential if you have to search on a mutually used computer or something like that. So that's all great information. Where can people find out more about you online as your activities and your work as an author?
Well, I've been so tied up with this book for so long that I've neglected my blog, but I did have a blog site.
Okay.
It's still active. It is femmedefinesse.com.
Okay.
And when I have time, I blog about things that women of finesse can do. I interviewed a gal that rides Harleys. I interviewed somebody on how she chooses her clothing, how she puts together her wardrobe. So just anything that women can do, I try to find somebody who's kind of an expert in that field and put it up there on the blog site. That
is fantastic. Where can they buy the book? And here again, let me give the title one more time. It's Standing Against the Rage by Linda Day Smith, based on the true story of Mildred Flatau, miraculous escape from domestic violence. Where can people get the book?
It is available on Amazon in both printed form and as an ebook.
Awesome. And all they have to do is either search you, Standing Against the Rage, Linda Day Smith, and obviously they can find it. Very interesting story. Reading through it, I was, like I said, most taken aback by this this happening in the 1930s, and we don't really, people taking out their family and doing these rampages is something that unfortunately we've become desensitized to in modern times. And a lot of us feel like it's a relatively recent occurrence, but this is something that has always been there to one degree or another. So it's almost like time traveling, and at the same time, it's reading something that could happen today.
Right. Yeah. And, the events of that day are so horrific. I'm not sure if there's a better word to use than horrific, and just tragic. Mildred's story is very uplifting.
Oh, sure.
And how she comes through that and really is able to not only lead a normal life, but be such a great influence to her two daughters and to her nieces and nephews. And her community. She is a person that, when this life is over, and that's the person I want to look up.
Yeah, sure.
And just tell her how much I admire her and just her strength and resilience.
It's very inspiring. And in a lot of ways, this woman was a strong individual, period. But in a lot of other ways, too, she was a woman that was so far ahead of her time in the way that she stood up for herself and moved forward and used this experience to raise her family and live a fulfilling life. It's a very inspiring story, and I'm very glad that you put it together.
Well, it was a real pleasure for me to have the privilege of telling her story, and I am very indebted to her family for being so gracious and generous with all of the research material. Awesome.
And you don't always get that. So that's a great thing. And absolutely a nod of gratitude to them for allowing this story to be told, because it is so powerful. We've been talking to Linda Day Smith. Linda, thank you very much for talking about how you put this together. It was great to have you on the podcast.
Well, thank you, Billy. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Again, Standing Against the Rage is available online. Author Linda Day Smith. Again, I want to mention that I'm here today on behalf of HO Press, Shore House Books, all the people at HumorOutcasts.com. Thank you very much for listening to our podcast today. My name is Billy Dees. Have a great day.